Pleasure to introduce our guest speaker for this evening. Who's officially going to launch the book. That's writer and journalist Mr. Kevin Myers.
Thank you. I confess I begin with a heavy heart because not merely is Dermot a wonderful biographer, he's truly a wonderful biographer, but he is a great reader of minds. And in the course of today, he read my mind in detail and stole my entire speech under my nose. And almost everything I had prepared in the 2 weeks since I received my first copy of this book has been said. But I did not arrive, so to speak, completely without symbolic significance. I arrived proudly wearing, as I have done for many years, it being the week it is, my poppy. I had barely arrived in the hall and I found my poppy gone. And who did I see wearing a poppy, just about the only one in the room, but Dermot? There. Twice over thief. Twice over fellow. So,
Poppy snatchers.
Sorry.
Poppy snatchers.
Poppy snatchers indeed, of the modern variety. So I now feel like the manager of the Gresham Hotel in the first week of May 1916, hoping to drum up business, because I have to, from the wreckage of my speech, address to you over the next few minutes. I must confess, I have found this last year of commemorations of 1913 to 2013 deeply disappointing. Instead of the kind of complex, nuanced narrative that I was hoping from the media, from the main media, the newspapers, and from RT and the broadcasting organisations generally, we have seen pretty much a rehash of the traditional Larkinite mythology, evil William Martin Murphy, noble Larkin. Now, the simple truth is that when Larkin returned in Ireland in 1923, the Transport General Workers Union took a lawsuit against him to expel him from the union headquarters, and in the course of that action, it transpired that at the time of Larkin's departure to America, £1,100 were missing from Transport Union funds, the records for which had been destroyed. Now this seems to me to be a pretty important feature of Larkin's personality. He had been imprisoned before for a union embezzlement, and people gave him the benefit of the doubt subsequently, but I believe that the events of 1923 indicate that he was light-fingered with people's money. Now, the important thing is not whether or not it was true. The important thing is, are we capable of holistically re-examining the myths that have prevailed in the national narrative over the last century or so? And the initial signs from this first year are that we are not. And we know now historically that 1966 and the commemorations of 1966 were a key point in the preparation of Ireland, nationalist Ireland, and more to the point, loyalist Ireland, which actually kicked off the Troubles. A key psychological preparation for them to start a war that lasted the best part of 30 years. And it's not just 1913, without referring to anyone by name. I was recently reading a book about this period, when one Irish historian referred to events after the Howth gun running in late July 1914, in which you all know there was an affray in Bachelor's Walk and some civilians were killed by soldiers. And one historian, citing another, with approval, said the army, apparently so reluctant to move against organised Ulster gun runners, was prepared to kill hostile but unarmed Dublin civilians. Well, the army, although certain members of its senior command were certainly implicit, Lord Roberts in particular, in the arming of the Ulster Volunteers, the army was not responsible for the policing of the population of Ireland. That was a matter for the police. And on that day of the Howth gun run, the Commissioner of Police and the Assistant Commissioner of Police in Dublin, the Dublin Metropolitan Police, acted against the wishes of the Undersecretary, James Doherty, in contacting the army and asking them to come to the assistance of the civil power. And Doherty contacted the Lord Chancellor, and the Lord Chancellor in Dublin said, under no circumstances must there be an attempt to disarm the volunteers coming from Howth. There are dubious legal reasons for doing so, and the consequences of disarming would be greater than the virtues, whatever virtues there might be, would be greater than the consequences of they're not acting. But by this time, the two police officers, Harrell and Ross, Commissioner Sir John Ross and Harrell, were acting on their own volition and were beyond the control of the Undersecretary, who went to Dublin Castle to stop the interception of the arms. Contrary to what you've heard in almost everything of this period, 2 soldiers were shot as they tried to arrest the arms shipment coming in at Clontarf. And the King's Own Scottish Borderers retreated in some disarray. Some guns had been taken. But by this time there was already a mutiny in Dublin Metropolitan Police led by 2 men, Michael Gleeson and Constable Andrew O'Neill 123D was his number. And up to 20 police officers refused to take action against the arms shipment people, the volunteers. Stones were thrown at the Cosbys, the King's Own Scottish Borders, when they reached Bachelor's Walk, and they did what soldiers did in Liverpool the year before and in South Wales. They opened fire. In Liverpool they killed 12 people. In South Wales they killed 6. It's what soldiers did in those days. It's what they did in their imperial duty. I mean, when they shot people in India, which they did a lot of, they weren't shooting armed Indians. It was an imperial police force that behaved like an imperial army, that behaved like an imperial army. The consequence of the arms shipment was that the guns were all returned to the Irish volunteers. The chief police officer and his assistant, Ross and Harrell, were both sacked. Gleeson and O'Neill were reinstated, as were 20 other police officers who had resigned. Now, you have to ask, how is it that this is not known? What process has brought about the reductionist headline version of the Howth arms smuggling? In that, it was a tragedy that 3 people died. But the man in charge of the picket of Cosby, whose men were responsible for the shooting, they shot 37 times against the orders of their Major Haig, but Captain Cobden was in their immediate command, and he was charged with manslaughter. He was arraigned on a charge of manslaughter. The formal charge hadn't been presented when his battalion was sent off to the Western Front, and he was one of the first soldiers captured in the British Army in the First World War, and he was released in 1918. So there you have an account for one of the pivotal moments of this period, psychologically and mentally and historically. And almost everything we've been told about it is wrong, just as almost everything people have been told about John Redmond. It has been wrong. And when I first talked about John Redmond on the Late Late Show over 30 years ago, I was booed by the audience, and people hissed at me that he had A, supported the executions, which was partly true, and B, he had tried to impose conscription on Ireland, which is not remotely true. And the more one looks at this time, gained with the hindsight that we have, as Dermot has already pointed out, the problems are intractable and virtually insoluble. And with all that I know about this period and all that I have read, I still see no solution to what turned into the partition of Ireland. One of the things that struck me reading the newspapers at the time was the level of guerrilla activity, terrorist activity, insurgent activity that was taking place against the UVF in the earliest days by nationalists in Derry. For example, UVF dispatch riders going into Bishop Street were regularly trapped by wire that was laid across their path, so that as they rode to the UVF headquarters, they would be pulled off their bicycles and injured. And there were several injuries incurred that way, merely testifying that the Northern Ireland itself, which wasn't yet a self-governing entity, was falling apart. And yet there was, across nationalist Ireland, then and for many decades after, was a complete failure to understand the authenticity and the validity and the power of unionist identity within Ulster. It was also true for Southern Irish Unionists, but they didn't represent a coherent bloc, nor did they represent an armed bloc. And Owen MacNeill, most fascinating, and Dermot is responsible for me discovering this, I said at one stage in 1914 that he felt a complete readiness to join hands with the Orange Party, but only on national grounds. Now, what kind of fatuous observation was that? He was prepared to join with the Orange Order on the grounds that they were not Orange Unionists anymore, but they were nationalists. This is like an ecumenical movement that only consists of Catholics. Yet there was this final conference in 1914, the Buckingham Palace Conference. And as Dermot points out, it was the last meeting of nationalists and unionists and British government in the one room until Sunningdale in 1973. 60 years had to go by before a relatively small number of people on this island, 3 to 4 million, could bring themselves to talk to one another in circumstances that are only of interest to themselves. Now, one of John Redmond's many great talents was his observation, which was as true then as it is true today, that Irish nationalists or Irish anything cannot get anything from Westminster or from London government without coercion of some kind. Now, he was entirely against breaking the law. But he did recognise there had to be political disruption for the British political class to take notice of Ireland. Otherwise, their attitude to Ireland was governed by the three I's: indolence, indifference, and ignorance. And the three I's governed the British perception of Ireland before the 1916 Rising, before the Home Rule crisis, before the Anglo-Irish War, as it's called, more of a civil war, as Dermot's pointed out. But nonetheless, there was a massive ignorance and indifference to Ireland. And one of the peculiar characteristics of Irish republicanism as it was formulated from 1914 onwards, we'll use that as a rough date, is its preference for dealing with the imperialist Britain rather than the democratic Britain. Now, it's very hard for us to understand the Janus-type thinking of an imperialist democrat. How can you be a democrat in the United Kingdom and insist on governing hundreds of millions of Indians against their consent? How are these two reconcilable? Well, within the imperial mindset, it's not necessary to reconcile them. I happened to read a John Buchan book last week. I just picked it up. It's called Mr. Standfast. And apart from, it's written in 1819, and apart from a cordial loathing, but it's expressed in extraordinary terms for the Irish, he refers to an African, not in quotations or not as a kind of semi-tongue-in-cheek thing. He refers to an African as a big buck nigger. Now, this man would not have thought himself a barbarian, but those are the words of a barbarian. But so, if you are dealing with people who are divided in mind like that, you should surely try to be negotiating with the more civilized side rather than the barbaric side. Because the barbaric side is really barbaric. 1919, the year of Salahad Beg, was also the year of Amritsar. And even now we don't know quite how many men, women, children died in Amritsar, but it's getting on for 1,000. It's worth pointing out that the governor of the province of Bengal was Punjab, I beg your pardon, was Michael O'Dwyer, who was himself from Salahad Beg. And the murders, and they can be called that freely, were organised by Reginald Dyer, his family came from Cork, and he was educated at Middleton College. So we had an Irish involvement in this criminal slaughter. So why would you prefer the imperial, brutal side of the person you're negotiating with, unless it fulfilled some mythology? Yet as it happened, those people who succeeded John Redmond, and the very great John Redmond, and from the first time I discovered his existence a long time ago, I've always regarded him as the greatest Irish statesman, with his failures, but the greatest Irish statesman of the 19th and 20th century. And I think very few people could ever come close to his achievements. But those people who succeeded him, their narrative was that they took on the might of the British Empire. Well, no, they didn't. I'll tell you who took on the might of the British Empire. That same time, almost coeval with the Irish War of Independence, were the people of Mesopotamia, who had been semi-annexed, also called Iraq, semi-annexed by the British after the end of the war and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. The same period, between Salahad Beg to the period of truce, in fighting in Mesopotamia, 6,295 Indian soldiers of the British Imperial Army and 751 British soldiers were killed. That's casualties of getting on 8,000 soldiers. The number of British soldiers killed in Ireland during that time was 177, allowing for the disappeared and so on. That comes to 200. And these would include the 3 band boys, teenage band boys, who hopped over the wall because they were bored, they had received discipline, and they were aged 15 years of age. They went from Ballincollig, were picked up by the IRA and murdered. That's the consequence of using unconstitutional action. You will have boys being killed, and boys being disappeared, and soldiers being disappeared. So it's not complex from the standpoint that I hold, and Dermot holds, and John Redmond held. It's not complex to see that the peaceful road isn't always easy, but it is always the best road. And when you use violence, violence gets out of control. It's like playing matches on dry grassland. You just say you want to have a campfire, but soon you will get, as we got, Protestants being murdered in their homes in West Cork, and a Protestant orphanage in Clifton being set fire to. Now, who could have thought that in 1916? And one of the narratives that succeeded in the succeeding years, and I can understand why it succeeded, because it's more beguiling than the reality. Dermot's already alluded to that. De Valera, in his later years, 1956, saw clemency and attended the centenary celebrations of Redmond's birth. And he said in his speech that he could never, of course, accept Redmond's espousal of the war, which would be a fair enough attitude from a conscientious objector. But this was the man who had raised arms in assistance with our gallant allies. And had the insurrection been successful in 1916, Ireland would have been like Flanders. There would have been a massive amount of bloodshed. So there was very few people in 1916 were actually anti-war. The Catholic Church wasn't anti-war, the Irish Parliamentary Party wasn't anti-war, and Sinn Féin wasn't anti-war. Sinn Féin just wanted the other side to win. So you can't say that Redmond was alone at fault for supporting the war effort. I myself have very confused attitudes towards Redmond's support of the British war effort. I think it was unproductive. I think, and it could only have been unproductive. On the other hand, he did not know what we all know about Flanders. He did not know what we all know about the Somme. He did not know what we all know about the executions of servicemen. So we are rich in knowledge in the way that he couldn't be. And given the riches of knowledge that we have, and that I have certainly worked on, I'm not saying it's particularly rich, but I can't resolve all the dilemmas presented by Germany invading Belgium in 1914. Is it right to have done nothing? Yeah, possibly. Is it right to have done something? Yes, possibly. To every answer, every question, you come up with the answer. Yes, possibly. And down the years, down the decades, the belief that somehow or other the British were responsible for the violence in Ireland, not just Northern Ireland, has been a keystone to particularly Fianna Fáil thinking. Obviously not so much in recent times. But after the Le Mans atrocity in 1978, which was condemned by Jack Lynch, he then said the only way of avoiding such atrocities is for the British to withdraw from Northern Ireland. Somewhat a year later, after the Mullaghmore atrocity, when Lord Mountbatten and the Countess Dowager Brabourne, both in their 80s, and 2 teenage boys, were blown up by the IRA, and that same day 17 soldiers were slaughtered at Narrow Water. Jack Lynch condemned those atrocities, and then went on to say the only way of avoiding such atrocities was for the British to withdraw. And that was the mantra. Ronan Fanning, in his seminal researches into this, has shown that in the Foreign Office there isn't one single letter from 1922 to 1969 from the Irish government to complain about the conditions of Northern nationalists, which by 1969 had become utterly unacceptable. It was all very well treating people as second-rate citizens if they were educationally backward, if they had no political power. But the emerging generation of the 1960s, because of the Education Acts, they were angry, and rightly so, and they saw their disadvantaged position and they determined to do something about it. But in the preceding decades, the Irish government, which saw itself as the guardian of the Irish nationalist community in the north, had done nothing whatever. Dermot has written, to my mind, one of the greatest books of Irish biography and of Irish history that I have ever encountered. It is a joy. It's a masterpiece. His publishers have done him proud. I don't think I've seen a better produced book ever from an Irish publisher. The footnotes are well worth browsing through. They're extraordinarily well informed, and like any good book, the footnotes are where you'll find many jewels, and they are not buried at the back of the book. They come at the end of every chapter, which makes them immediately accessible. I think this book is a triumph. I'm really pleased to be here, even if I have been the victim of larceny and felony and highway burglary and robbery and all those other terrible things. And I'm just grateful that he left me with my suit, of which I'm rather proud. And I poured a glass of water to put down here before Dermot started speaking. There were 3 other glasses of water. He took from 2 of the other glasses, but not mine. He left my water.
Oh, yeah.
When Kevin holds this water, Kevin unpeaceful, unfree shall never be at peace. Dermot, well done. Publishers, Irish Academic Press, well done. It's been an enormous pleasure being here, an enormous pleasure to launch this book. I can't think of a more important book, a more impressive book that is going to come out in this decade of centenary. So, well done. Thank you.